Okay, so welcome to another edition of Jews and the News. And I'm going to mute all just, and then feel free to unmute at any time to for a comment or a question. There is so much in the news, and my head is spinning from just looking at New York Times, Times of Israel every day. But I had this article from the New York Times that's been sitting in my inbox because I wanted to share it. It was written in November 20th. And I'm going to share it with you now from New York Times just about the idea of protest. That is, social justice agencies and protest movements that in terms of protesting President Trump's policies and what people are feeling at this time about the potential success of any of such protest. So just letting one more person in, and then I'll share my screen. Um, again, this is I don't like to share directly from the websites of the newspapers because there are all these pop-up ads that come up. So it's just easier to cut and paste the article itself into a Google document so then we're not distracted at all. So, like I said, this article by Katie Benner, written November 20th for the New York Times, is titled Get Somebody Else to Do It. Trump Resistance Encounters Fatigue. So I should put this here, yes. Um, so Donald Trump's grassroots opponents search for a new playbook as they reckon with how little they accomplished during his first term. So before I get into it, I just want to say that I've said from the Bema a couple of times that since January 20th, that I'm not sure. So I want to be very careful here. I understand there are people who could be watching this recording, people who are attending this live right now, who may have voted for President Trump. And I don't want to argue about that. I do want to say, though, that it is quite clear from the way I've spoken just the past few months and the way I've spoken, I think, for the past 30 and a half years as the rabbi of Shaarei Tefillah, that you know where my politics, where I lean social justice wise. So let's do it that way as opposed to politics. I try very hard not to talk in favor or against any particular candidate from the Bema, but try instead to talk about policy of a president and the effect it might have on the people. So that's the issue for me, is the effect of President Trump's actions and his policy regarding issues that I think historically the Jewish community have held dear and have advocated for. And I personally think that it's just common sense that this is what we need to be advocating for. So whether it's the rights of people to immigrate lawfully to this country, the right of people to seek asylum. I mean, that to me is a no-brainer because that's how our country was founded, people seeking asylum. I don't think there's much more to say about that, other than we should always be looking out for people who immigrate to this country and seek asylum. I think gun control, I think diversity, uh, understanding the multifaceted, nuanced history of our country, as opposed to promoting one particular narrative and intentionally ignoring other narratives and other stories. I think and there are many other women's rights and reproductive rights, et cetera, et cetera. The list can go on and on. And so it's those issues that I protest and advocate for, as opposed to a person, at least in this format, as in my position as rabbi of the synagogue. I'm not going to speak out against the person, but rather the policies. Okay, so I hope that's clear, and I hope that I've made that clear every other time I've talked about subjects like this. So what I started to say is that for the past several weeks, since January 20th, since my head is spinning about all these issues that are arising, and always there's something new that is just flabbergasting and terrible that we're reading about. What I'm Part of what I'm upset about is that there doesn't seem to be anybody standing up and leading a protest movement against these issues. I get emails from my congressman, who I think is mostly is your congressman also, District 8 District 8 in the congressional district of the state of Maryland, Jamie Raskin, and he goes on and on about how he's upset about what's going on, and then asks for a donation. So that's not what I want to do. I don't want to give money to a particular. We're in a blue state, so the congressman's going to do what the congressman's going to do. But until there's a Democratic majority in Congress and the Senate, there's really nothing that our congressmen and senators can do. So I am looking for people to stand up and who are gain some traction in terms of people listening to what they have to say. And I'm looking for social justice organizations to be standing up and gaining traction with people, rallying around them, or planning protest marches in Washington that might be reasonable, something to advertise and say, hey, maybe people in the synagogue might want to go to this rally that is going to be taking place. But I haven't heard anything about that. And even though this article was written November 20th, shortly after the election, I think it reflects a particular perspective as to why we might not be hearing anything yet in terms of an organized kind of protest. Just a second, somebody else is coming into the waiting room, and I just want to make sure that they stay muted. Okay, so okay, so again, just want to make sure everybody stays muted. The article again, November 20th, 2024. In the days after Donald Trump's electoral victory, thousands of people revived the grassroots movement that opposed his first term in office. Marchers in Manhattan took over streets carrying a block-wide banner that read, "We won't back down." Activists in Los Angeles and Chicago decried Mr. Trump's abortion and immigration policies and vowed to descend on Washington to protest his inauguration in January. But participants noted that Mr. Trump had not appeared to be swayed by protests, petitions, hashtag campaigns, or other tools of mass dissent. Many have been calling for a fresh playbook. "I thought the first Women's March would be a turning point," said Laura Bartek, a 45-year-old nurse from Virginia, referring to the protest with nearly 500,000 people that took place after Mr. Trump's 2017 inauguration. "To be here 8 years later with these signs," Ms. Bartek said during a recent protest in Washington, "it breaks my heart." Okay, so this is a half a million people marched in Washington, the Women's March in 2017. The fact that 8 years later, President Trump was elected again. So, okay, I keep getting emails to sign petitions, said Leslie Mack, a digital strategist and communications expert who works with grassroots organizations. These people coming to the White House don't care about petitions. They don't care how many people sign them. They don't care what they say. The first Trump presidency spawned the largest protest the country had seen in half a century. But not everyone wants to participate in another 4 years of mass movement work. When Women's March shared information about an upcoming rally on Instagram, one person responded, "No, I'm tired. Y'all have fun, though." Women's March later hid some of the pushback and limited who could respond to a handful of posts. I thought the first Women's March would be a turning point. On TikTok, plans for the march were met with memes of women saying, "Get somebody else to do it." This is an opportunity for a national brunch day for the 93%, said one user, referring to the 93% of black women who exit polls suggested had voted for Vice President Kamala Harris. Others question whether the previous protests had resulted in substantial concessions. Mr. Trump's three Supreme Court appointees overturned Roe v. Wade after nearly 500,000 pink-hatted participants in the first Women's March called for upholding abortion rights. The Trump administration ultimately imposed a travel ban, barring most travelers from 5 majority Muslim countries, North Korea, and Venezuela, even though large swaths of the public initially condemned the action. The demonstrations that erupted after the killing of George Floyd by police officers in Minneapolis did not result in federal police reform laws under either Mr. Trump or President Biden. And Mr. Biden has largely ignored fierce protests over Israel's mass killing of Palestinians in Gaza. So you got to get, so the author just had to get one Biden protest that hasn't worked either, but focusing mostly on protests about President Trump, I guess just out of a sense like it has to be even-handed in this article. But the point is, massive demonstrations that had been organized, whether it was about abortion rights, whether it was about a travel ban, or whether it's about police reform, or whether it's even about Israel's policies in fighting back against Hamas. What is the reason why protests are going largely unheard? The left's failure to shift policy has contrasted markedly with past movements that helped spur progressive legislative changes. Civil rights marches, lunch counter sit-ins, and voter drives led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Acts of 1965. Protests against the Vietnam War pressured President Nixon to withdraw from the conflict. And AIDS-related activism moved the government to create and distribute medications that saved the lives of thousands of gay men and advanced equal rights for the LGBTQ community. Right? Now, it wasn't just one march for all of these things that did the trick. It was a series of marches and protests and coordinated protests, and for some that took many years to do so, but it was the protests that affected change. The stark difference is in keeping with a sharp global reversal in the power of mass action, some political analysts say. At the beginning of this century, about 2 in 3 protest movements around the world could show measurable success, versus only 1 in 6 today, according to researchers at Harvard. All right, so at the beginning, so 25 years ago, 66% of protests would have some kind of impact. Whereas, I don't know what the percentage point for 1/6 is. What is that, 12%? No, 20, 15%, 18%, something like that. Only 18% of protests have some kind of impact today. This is in part because more governments are leaning toward authoritarianism and are less willing to respond to dissent, said Lisa Mueller, a professor at Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota, who studies why protest movements succeed or fail. Okay, so if more and more governments are becoming authoritarian, then yes, authoritarian governments don't pay attention to protest movements. Just look at Syria and the ongoing civil war, where the President Assad was killing his own people, and he just kept on killing no matter what people were doing to fight back. When AIDS activists barricaded the NIH, Tony Fauci invited them in for a conversation and forged a collaboration, Ms. Mueller said. The activists listened to the science, but they also started helping to set the scientific agenda. Similarly, former President Lyndon Johnson was willing to negotiate with civil rights activists on legislation and government policy. In contrast, Mr. Trump has said that he regrets not using the military to quell the Black Lives Matter protests. His advisors have recommended that he use the Insurrection Act of 1807 to crush future unrest. Some organizers reject the idea that mass actions during the first Trump administration were ineffective. We saw a big result from the Women's March after the 2016 election, said Shauna Thomas, the co-founder of Ultraviolet, which fights for feminist cultural and political change. She added, the feminist movement grew significantly both online and offline, and you saw some significant electoral wins 2 years later. Ms. Thomas also said that gerrymandering and Republican control of the courts have made it difficult for left-leaning voters to gain and maintain political power. Okay, so it's the rise of authoritarian governments worldwide that affect the influence that protest movements can have. Gerrymandering of congressional districts ensures that a particular party can win that district over another one, and also Republican appointees to the courts also affect that. So what is stopping President Trump now are some judges across the country who were appointed, probably appointed by somebody else to stop some of these executive orders from taking place, or even trying to reverse some of them too. Some activists said they were rethinking how and where to organize. Some of the biggest changes may be around how people think about the online organizing that has characterized the past 20 years of movement work, such as petition writing and hashtag campaigns. Digital spaces are not your friend anymore, said Ms. Mack, who said that some groups are organizing less on social media for fear of online attacks by political opponents. Social media platforms, she noted, are controlled by executives like Mark Zuckerberg, the owner of Facebook and Instagram, who congratulated Mr. Trump on his win, or like Elon Musk, who has become a key player in the transition, right, who also owns X, formerly known as Twitter, right? So gaining support on social media isn't necessarily a way to do it because of the possibility that the owner of those social media platforms could quash any kind of dissent against the president or his policies. Wariness of social media will reduce the reach that activists have had, but it could also have unexpected upsides. Social media turned activism organizing into a kind of public relations job where your follower count and where you were quoted mattered as much as the tangible work that was being done, Ms. Mack said. I'm not saying that good things didn't happen in online spaces, but sponsorships and brand deals started to intermingle with activism. It was celebrity. The Trump era could usher in a revival of local in-person activism as people find new places to put their energy with people they know well. Already during the Biden administration, conservative grassroots activists pushed successfully for abortion bans, remaking school curriculums, and banning books from libraries. Liberal grassroots groups emerged to reverse some of those measures. Activists also predict a rise in mutual aid groups within, for example, immigrant communities targeted for deportation under a new Trump administration. Other activists said they would continue to. So, one way to fight against what the article is suggesting is grassroots movements. Um, I'm not familiar with the immigrant community per se, especially the the Latino immigrant community. So I know there are organizations like CASA and other organizations like that that represent the Latino immigrant community and work on their behalf. So, but I don't follow them. I don't receive emails for them. But I would imagine that the Latino immigrant community could be a complicated space to work in. Certainly, some immigrants who have been here for a while are in the process of getting a green card or have one or are immigrants already are in a different stage of activism than people who have just arrived and have arrived here legally, but certainly are nowhere near getting a green card and like how to they have their children as students in public school. Their knowledge of English might be limited, and getting them to trust anybody who's working on their behalf might be difficult too. So that's just one segment of this whole thing is how to work within the immigrant community to get the community to trust and to fight for their rights. Other activists said that they would continue to work of getting like-minded peers elected to positions of power. So that's another thing too. We have to wait for 2 more years when there's next congressional election and some senators are going to be elected as well, and governors too. So that maybe there could be a shift that way in the political balance. We've marched so much, we're tired of doing the same thing over and over, said David Hogg, who was among the students in Parkland, Florida, who mobilized on behalf of gun control legislation in the wake of the mass shooting there, right? Can you imagine? I've mentioned this before, right? I attended that March for Our Lives rally in DC in March, whatever it was, 6 years ago, 5 years ago, 7 years ago, whatever it was, a couple months after the Parkland, Florida shooting, and it was on a Shabbat, and I said to the shul, I'm going downtown for Shabbat, and I'm going to attend this rally. Let's meet at Sixth and I, and for Shabbat service, and then we'll go to the rally, and people did attend that, and there was a lot of positive feeling that maybe finally something would be done, and tragically, there have just been more shootings and no change in any way in gun control legislation. After the election, I got several texts saying, "Screw it. People in power don't know what they're doing, and I need to run." We need to be positioned to bring a new generation into office, so we're not just protesting and marching, Mr. Hogg said. We can't be outside looking in. Protesters who took to the streets after the election said that they were there to rejuvenate a community around shared ideals. Ms. Bartek carried signs and buttons from the past decade of protests that she has attended. The 2017 Women's March, the 2022 protest on the Supreme Court steps when the justices overturned Roe. She said that her great-great-grandmother was a suffragist, and her grandmother attended the March on Washington in 1963 when Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his I Have a Dream speech. Protesting makes me personally feel better, she said. I want to believe that the majority of Americans are good. The protests this month also drew out of younger people who were not around for past marches. Kira Miller, a 19-year-old student at the University of Richmond who attended a protest in Washington, said she believed that failures in the education system cause young voters to be uninformed and therefore apolitical or apathetic. Marches can help bridge that gap. There's power in the visual impact of protests, she said, and in the attention that they bring to issues. Her classmate, Sydney Cameron, 19 years old, said that in 2016 she expected to see a woman elected president. This year I thought I'd see another historic moment, she said, and it failed again. Ms. Cameron said she recently asked her grandmother, who lived through the civil rights movements in the 60s, whether it was worth going into the streets. She told me, Sydney, it's always a fight worth fighting, Miss Cameron said. Will the fight end? No, but this is not the time to sit back and watch and let this happen all over again. She added, you fight for your daughter, and your daughter fights for hers. So I wanted to share that article and just share the frustration that it contains, but also and with some data points that it has with it as well, but also ending with like this positive outlook, saying, you have to keep on fighting, you can't give up. And that's the idea that I have. Certainly, that's what we need to do. Social justice activists know that there's always something to fight for, and there will always be something to fight for. The statement from the Pirkei Avot teaches us, Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor, velo ata ben chorin lehibatel mimena. You can't give up. The burden is yours to keep on working, and you can't give up the fight. That you have to. There's always causes to stand up for, people to protect, causes, social justice issues that need to be fought for. And but what I started this conversation about is how difficult it is in the face of an onslaught of so many things. It's one thing to put your finger in the dike to stop one flow of water from coming out of the dike. It's another thing when there are 10 holes, or maybe there are 15 holes, and you don't have enough fingers and toes to fill up the dike to ensure that the wall doesn't come crashing down on you, right? And that's what it kind of feels right now, that there are so many of these issues, and that there aren't enough people or organizations standing up in the face of it to protect the average American, and not just the average American, the disadvantaged, poor Americans who need protection. So the idea that we need to keep fighting, yes, absolutely, we need to keep fighting, but it's just been difficult to do that. So any questions or comments about this?
A couple.
Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
I was also at the rally a number of years ago. I felt like I was back in college when we
Yeah.
were protesting the Vietnam War. But the other thing is, I think people are afraid,
Ah,
because you hear a judge issues a ruling and they're going after the judge. You just say something and people, I think people are afraid that they're going to be goons coming after you.
yeah. So that's the problem. Well, that's not the problem. That's the challenge of protesting within a country that has some authoritarianism in it. So that a judge issues an order that the Venezuelans should not be deported, and the person in the Trump administration or the Department of Justice writes back, sorry, or oops, no, oopsie. He responded, oopsie, on Twitter or X or Facebook or something. Oopsie, with a laughing emoji with tears coming out. And the official response was, well, the plane was in the air already over international waters when the judge issued that order. So, there's always that fear, and look what happened in the civil rights era when the African American community protested. People would be jailed. Dr. Martin Luther King was jailed. Fire departments were called out, and the fire hoses were sprayed on protesters. It was a scary time, and then during the McCarthy era in the early 50s, there was a congressional committee out to blackball people who supposedly were communist or had communist tendencies. So yeah, there are times when it takes a lot of courage to stand up, especially knowing that maybe you'll be arrested or something else will happen to you to affect your livelihood and the safety of your family. Um, so yeah, and so that's the other scary thing about this time that we're living in. Um, there was something that I saw in Times of Israel today about Prime Minister Netanyahu wants to fire the head of Israel's security, Shin Bet, and he doesn't have the right to summarily fire the Shin Bet. There needs to be some legal proceedings that have to happen first. And so people are protesting in the streets, and a teacher in a school somewhere in Israel was suggesting to her students to participate in the protest. And there was an article in the Times of Israel saying how Prime Minister Netanyahu is instructing the education ministry to withhold funds from that school because the teacher had suggested that students go out and protest. So this is what happens in authoritarianist leaning administrations. So it is scary, but it's even more reason to stand up and protest because these are dangers to democracy. Was founded as a democratic state. Our country, of course, founded as a democratic state, and it is scary to see what's happening, and that much more reason to try to find people and groups that will lead the protest. Any other questions or comments? Yeah, Jesse.
Hi, everyone. I would just, I think we need to be careful not to assume that our values are representative of the American people's values. I think you really nailed it at the outset when you said we really have to differentiate the president and his kind of weird personality from the issues that he is associated with,
Yeah.
like trade policies,
Hmm.
immigration. Anti-immigration is woven into the bedrock of the American experience. Tariffs and mercantilism are embedded into American policy and has been going back to the 1790s.
Yeah.
Some of the things that you mentioned, some of the things may seem self-evident to us,
Hmm.
but they're not necessarily self-evident to a majority of the American people.
Right.
And when we scratch our head and say, geez, how is it that there hasn't been a mass uprising? It's because I think Trump's policies, again, keeping Trump the person out of it, but his policies are representative of maybe a majority of the American people. And so for us to say, well, we need to work harder is really to suggest that we can undo the results of the election
Mm.
and to um, to silence the so-called silent majority who may believe very devoutly and legitimately that Trump's policies are the right policies for the country.
All right, so Jesse, so what I'm hoping is that you're wrong, because I don't want to live in a country that
Mhm.
if the
Well,
majority of the country is supporting these policies and want these policies to continue. So what I'm hoping for is, so the bedrock of of America is protests, right? How else would America have been founded as a country if not for the Boston Tea Party and other protests, right? So that's what we're all about is protesting. So if protests don't lead to the majority of people following behind, then it's a failed protest movement. Okay, so I think though that protests need to happen. And I think you can have a person representing my values in office, and you can have rightly and fairly and justly people protesting that. If January 6th, 2021 had been a lawful, peaceful protest, it would have been upsetting, but it would have been absolutely right for people to protest. People have the
Mhm.
right to protest. Okay? So so that's my point, that I think we need to protest. And if there were to be some rallies on Washington and some other large scale movements afoot to try to protest, and then they failed, then I would be extremely sad and would despair. But at least we've tried. And what I haven't seen is the attempt yet at large scale national protest, and I haven't seen somebody stand up, a politician who would say, this is what we need to believe in, and this is what America stands for. So I haven't heard that yet, and I'm waiting for that. Perhaps the politicians' heads are spinning, and perhaps some politicians are afraid also themselves of standing up and putting themselves in the crosshairs. But I'm not convinced. I am convinced that President Trump won the election. I'm not denying that. And the majority of the country voted for him in the popular vote. He got the electoral votes that he needed to. So he won a hands down. But that doesn't mean that the people who voted for him will continue to support him. I can't imagine that people who are affected by the economy, who were hoping for President Trump to turn things around and bring inflation down, will be happy. They're certainly not happy now, and won't be happy a few months from now unless some miracle happens and things turn around. So the support that President Trump received could be temporary, or at least I'm hoping, for my vision of what America stands for, in terms of the social justice values that it is built upon. I'm hoping that the majority, that this does not represent, that his election a couple of months ago does not represent a shift that is going to be present in the country for years to come. I think then that I can't imagine living in this country if that's the case, and I can't imagine just what that will mean for our children and grandchildren going forward either. So that's why I think that protest is important, and that's why I think that article was important, to reflect the idea how tired people are and frustrated people are, as trying to find a new way to get a message across. Any other thoughts or comments? So, Bob, did you have something
I
else?
was just going to say, one day, can you just bring some good news?
Yeah, I was just thinking that too. Like, how am I going to close this out in a positive way? And I'm not sure there is a positive way to close this out, except for that statement from the Pirkei vote again, that we have to keep on fighting, because it's our spiritual, it's our godly mission to do so, and that hopefully we'll find a way to do that. So, thanks for being here tonight, and have a good night, everybody.
Thank you. Bye bye.